So today is 807 cerebellum. We're going to try and do a little bit of anatomy, physio, and clinical applications today since we didn't really get Wednesday to work on it. This is your cerebellum, just starting to fly through it. This one down here is called the flocculonodular lobe. Nodular lobe. It gets its afferents from your vestibular canals in your ears. Vestibular canals in your ears. It's going to get afferents from your cervical spine. Cervical spine goes in there. It's going to get afferents from your eyes. And it's going to take all three and it's going to combine them together to give us balanced coordination. The idea is when we move our head, there's three things that are going to happen. We're going to want our eyes to equally go the opposite direction so that we can stay foveated on our target. But our head's going to move, so we're going to have to control our neck musculature and coordinate it with the movement of our eyes. And we're going to have to do all of this so that we don't just fall over every time we try and look at something. So the flocculonodular lobe is majority important for equilibrium. That's going to be the big thing, is equilibrium. And it's just going to be a processor for the three of them. It's going to shoot out to the pons out here in the brain stem. It talks to the vestibular nucleus in the pons. And the vestibular nucleus will have descending fibers to your tonic neck reflexes. And then it will also have ascending stuff to the MLF to control cranial nerve 3 and control cranial nerve 6 so that our eyes can move equally with our neck. Okay? So it keeps everything moving together smoothly. Right here in the middle, you got the vermis. Vermis. I really think of the vermis as a spine. It's the only one of the only midline structures in the whole brain, right? The brain is divided by that falx cerebri. It's got the corpus callosum connecting each half, but where's the spine's representation is majority here. Now you do have somatic representations of your spine in your parietal lobes, and those are more sided. But when we talk about control of our spine and the musculature surrounding it, we talk about the vermal region. When you have an adjustment, you're going to light up the vermis like a Christmas tree. Like this is going to be the big thing you hit. And it's going to spread out of here. So yeah, you light up the vermis with the adjustment, but it starts to light up everything around the vermis too. So when we start talking about the organization of the deep cerebellar nuclei, or the nuclei that rest way deep in there, we're going to talk about fat guys eat donuts. Okay, that's the mnemonic. Fat guys eat donuts is going to be fastigial, is midline. That's going to control more of our trunk musculature, even our trunk. Then we're going to have out here, fat guys is going to be globose. Slightly lateral is emboliform. And the two of them together make up the interpost nucleus. These are more responsible for coordinating the actions of our shoulder girdles and our elbows, okay? So when we start testing, when we're doing finger to noses, and they're having breakdowns right there, it's not that their fingers are all out, it's not that their dentate out here is fried, or even that their fastigial nucleus is fried, but that the ones that control here, that interpost nucleus, is a little shot. So on the finger to nose, we can really start taking a look at this part of the cerebellum. The most lateral of these is going to be the dentate nucleus out here. The dentate nucleus is responsible for controlling the coordination of our hands, maybe even our feet a little bit. And now, the way it works is that the oldest stuff, phylogenetically, is near the midline. So the flocculonodular lobe is by far the oldest thing. Fish had this. It's called the lateral line system. They had like these little hairs coming out the sides of their bodies, and they were at different altitudes in their bodies. So if they would be swimming, the water would be hitting these, and if they tilted up, the water would hit them in a different pattern, and it would send a different pattern to their flocculonodular lobe to let their brain know that they just shifted up. And then in response, they would shift other parts down to control that. And they have these big old spines, and they develop vermal regions to control the coordination of their spine to get that going. But as we started to get onto land and needed to crawl around, our cerebellum continued to evolve, and it grew out like this. And now all of a sudden we have these globose and emboliform nuclei in there, giving us some limb buds to start crawling around. And then finally, as we become primates and we need opposable thumbs to do machinery and tools and stuff like that, we needed a dentate nucleus to even further grow the cerebellum and control the fine motor skills of the dentate nucleus. Now, the dentate out here is going to be the newest phylogenetically, but also what else do we have as humans that's more new to us is going to be cognitive functions, critical thinking stuff. And all of that is also processed out here in the lateral cerebellum. So you can think about how we evolved and how it's going to affect the development of our brain. So when they start talking about like paleocerebellum, the neocerebellum, new cerebellum is going to be out here. Neocerebellum, they consider more of the hemispheres. Paleocerebellum is going to be the vermis. And then the very oldest, archaeocerebellum, is going to be the flocculonodular lobe. Archaeo. Each breakdown in any one of these places will create a unique lesion. It's important that you understand the characteristics of those lesions. They're in the PowerPoint. I can make sure you have that. It's going to be important that you know those for the board exam. So that's a brief breakdown of the anatomy of the cerebellum. It fires into the pons to regulate the nucleus tractus solitarius, so it is heavily involved in autonomic function. Breakdown of the cerebellum is going to have failure to regulate that MTS. You'll get parasympathetic escapes. Their stomach will growl. They could have constipation issues, all sorts of stuff like that. Okay? Now, when you start thinking about the histology of the cerebellum, the majority of it is inhibitory. Okay? You're going to have inputs coming through mossy fibers and what? Mossy fibers and climbing fibers. The climbing fibers come from your inferior olive down here in your medulla, and it's going to climb up here to modify existing motor programs. Then you're going to have mossy fibers coming from everywhere else. All your proprioceptors in your body are going to fire up, and some are going to become like, oh, I feel that, but a lot of them are going to go through your spinocerebellar tracts, hit your cerebellum, and tell your cerebellum what just happened, okay, through the mossy fiber system. So if you move your elbow from here to here, your brain needs to know that just happened, or else it will give improper commands to your body and you'll destroy your body, essentially, right? Cerebellum says you'll tear yourself limb from limb. So by doing that movement right there, you're going to fire these mossy fibers up here to tell the brain what just moved and now how do we move it. But if we're trying to learn a new skill and we've been swinging the bat this way for a couple years, and now the guy tells us, well, move your hand just a little bit lower and cock that shoulder, we're modifying that existing motor program, and we're going to be doing that through our inferior olivary system, through these climbing fibers. Now, the majority of these are going to fire down to these deep cerebellar nuclei to inhibit them. They're going to try and inhibit the deep cerebellar nuclei. And then the output of deep cerebellar nuclei is inhibitory in general. So breakdown in the cerebellum basically means a breakdown in inhibition, okay? But what you also need to recognize is that the cerebellum, since it's so densely packed with neurons, it's the first to fail to toxic problems, to metabolic problems, to systemic problems. It's gonna, and when that stuff happens, it affects all of this stuff that inhibits those deep cerebellum nuclei. And then you'll have too much inhibition. Does that make sense? So it depends where the problem's coming from. But generally, a breakdown in the cerebellum means a loss of inhibition. So when you're doing a finger to nose, and they're coming in, they're not able to inhibit those extra movements. That's why there's a tremor. Now we could have a hyperplastic cerebellum on the other hand, one that's functioning too high, and we'd see really great movement. but perhaps it's too inhibited and they stop short of their nose. They're hypometric. That's something to look for too. There's different protocols on how to rehab a hypocerebellum or a hypercerebellum. Generally, hypocerebellum is going to be easier to rehab. Adjustments are a really good way to rehab ipsilaterally. So if their right cerebellum is not inhibiting all that way, you can start adjusting them on the right. And depending on where the nucleus is that you're trying to target, it's going to change what you're adjusting. Some people might respond better to a shoulder or knee adjustment. Some people might respond better to a spine adjustment, but even that's a good point. Somebody could have a shoulder problem because they have a problem in their globose nucleus, and what you could do is you could adjust the hip. And since the hip is connected to that shoulder in that nucleus, you could rehab that shoulder just by adjusting that hip, and thus neurologically change the tuning on that shoulder. You see, if the cerebellum's not controlling the musculature around the shoulder, maybe that could be a source of their pain. So we always need to say, is the source of the pain at the spot where it hurts, or is it suprasegmental? And that's going to determine what we do. If it's coming from the brain and keep treating the shoulder might never get better. And that's the mistake that we see sometimes. It's up to you as a practitioner to start correlating things. What happens is, yeah, their shoulder hurts. We're not going to call it a cerebellar issue, but if their shoulder hurts and they have balance issues, you put them in a gated Romberg and they fall over, maybe it is a cerebellar issue, maybe we should try cerebellum. As always in functional neurology, you're going to test, intervene, retest. So their shoulder hurts, give them a cerebellar exercise, and then see if the shoulder gets better. A really good cerebellar exercise is going to be, as you turn your head to the right, you're activating right ear canals. And that's going to feed heavily into here and here and feed that right cerebellum. So what you do is you have this person spin to the right slowly, doing one big spin. Now what you can do at the same time is have their right thumb out, have their eyes fixating on it, and then spin to the right. And now they're using their frontal lobe to inhibit that VOR system that would have knocked their eyes back to the left naturally. And the frontal lobe is actually going to feed forward into that cerebellum. So it's actually a more profound cerebellar exercise. So think about the pathways, think about what you're activating every time you ask somebody to do. Cerebellum is also important in mental rehearsal. We can see all the time, they've done a ton of studies, that if you've got two people who are going to go skiing, both have never gone skiing, and one person put in ski lessons and then one person mentally rehearses skiing all day, you'll see similar results in skill just from the mental rehearsal. That's because in both of these cases, they're activating their cerebellum, creating a motor program on how to do it. So cerebellum is responsible for motor rehearsal in our brains, and it also has a profound effect on how we do it. So let's cut the video and we'll play with some clinical